The fire trucks were screaming down the road, lights spinning like a tornado of urgency, when they suddenly stopped. Not because they had reached the burning bakery on 6th Street. No. They stopped because their backup power relay had failed. The hydrants wouldn't pressurize. The station's grid system had gone dark. Chaos erupted over the radio. And all of it traced back to a single point. Not a transformer or a substation. No. It all pointed to one suburban driveway where earlier that afternoon Karen, vice president of the HOA and self-proclaimed neighborhood enforcer, had marched over to my charging unit, yanked the industrial cable from its socket, and tossed it across the lawn like she was banishing a demon. I remember her words like a bad sitcom rerun. This junk doesn't belong in our neighborhood. You want to plug in your toys, go live on a solar commune. And then she strutted off, heels clacking like a judge's gavel, not realizing she'd just disconnected the fire department's emergency backup grid. The cable she thought was just powering my EV was tied to a licensed, grant-funded, city-permitted solar inverter that kept Fire Station 4's battery banks charged in emergencies. And that day? It was all that stood between a kitchen fire and a full-blown neighborhood disaster. 12 hours earlier, it had been a calm, almost annoyingly perfect morning. Birds chirped. My dog Baxter rolled around on the front lawn like an overpaid houseguest. I had just finished syncing the diagnostic panel on my home grid relay and was feeling rather proud of myself. As an energy systems consultant for the city's emergency infrastructure team, I took pride in keeping things running, especially the high-priority lines most folks didn't even know existed. My home was part of a small backup grid designed to quietly support nearby emergency services. My EV charger wasn't just for my car. It was a high-capacity relay tied to a solar buffer I'd personally installed and calibrated. That buffer ran clean through my underground conduit into Fire Station 4's backup system, 2 blocks away. It wasn't flashy. It didn't glow. But it mattered. And then, of course, came the clacking. Karen's heels announced her arrival long before her voice did. She was power-walking up my driveway like she was delivering a subpoena, waving a laminated HOA policy sheet in one hand and her Starbucks in the other. Her face was set in that familiar expression of tight-lipped, passive-aggressive determination. I knew I was about to be graced with one of her signature Karen speeches. She didn't disappoint. She started with the usual pleasantries about the appearance of the neighborhood and the importance of uniformity. Then she launched into a tirade about how my charging station was an unsightly object visible from the street and how the HOA had unanimously voted against unapproved outdoor tech fixtures. I raised an eyebrow. I'd never been shown a vote, nor had any of the neighbors I'd spoken to. But logic doesn't work on people like Karen when they've already decided they're right. I calmly explained that the system was approved, not only by the HOA 2 years ago, but also registered with the city as part of the Emergency Energy Initiative. I even offered to show her the permits. That's when she said the line that would haunt her for weeks. Nobody in this neighborhood wants to live next to a transformer station. We're not a utility yard. We're a community. Before I could react, she strode over, grabbed the thick charging cable, clearly labeled with a warning sticker, and yanked it out of the charging box. I heard the magnetic seal pop and the soft thud of the internal relays failing. My jaw dropped. For a moment we both just stood there. She looked victorious. I was stunned. That cable wasn't just for my EV. It was the main line that connected to a transfer switch beneath the driveway, which in turn tied to the fire station's backup inverters. The system was designed with redundancy, but with the main line severed, the station's batteries would now be limited to local capacity, and if a long outage or sudden demand hit, they'd be stranded. I tried to explain. I tried calmly. I even pointed to the city tag welded onto the charger's side. But Karen waved me off with that signature scoff and said, "You and your made-up tech stories. Just plug it back in like a normal car and stop pretending you're running NASA. The thing about systems like this is they don't just restart with a switch. Safety protocols require manual reset. Which meant until I went through the reboot sequence, the entire grid connection was down. Karen wasn't just being rude. She had just put people's lives at risk. And she did it with the smugness of someone returning a late library book. I reported the incident to the HOA, not that I expected much. Karen was the vice president, and the president, a mild-mannered retired dentist named Eugene, was notoriously passive. Karen had a way of running the show through sheer noise. She had already bullied several neighbors into repainting their mailboxes and once threatened to fine a veteran 2 houses down because his flag was slightly faded. This wasn't new behavior. But now she'd crossed into dangerous territory. That night, I was working through the reboot process in the garage when I saw red lights flashing across the ceiling. I stepped outside just in time to see the fire chief's vehicle pull into the driveway. A man in a soot-streaked turnout coat stepped out and introduced himself as Chief Morales. He didn't look pleased. Apparently, during an unrelated equipment test earlier that afternoon, the station's backup power had failed. He traced the circuit logs and narrowed the issue to my address. I explained everything. The setup, the solar buffer, the HOA interference. He nodded grimly. Then, as if summoned by drama itself, Karen stormed out of her house across the street. She had clearly seen the flashing lights and assumed, once again, that something criminal was happening. She marched up, shouting at the fire chief to stop trespassing, claiming the city had no right to audit private citizens, and accusing him of harassment. That's when she pulled her phone out and started calling 911. Chief Morales, stunned but calm, asked her if she understood what she was doing. She declared loudly that she was reporting a fraudulent officer impersonating fire services. I watched in disbelief as she gave the dispatcher her location and tried to have the man in charge of Station 4 arrested on his own call-out. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. Dispatch, likely confused but cautious, sent a patrol car. When the officer arrived, he immediately recognized the chief, but Karen wouldn't back down. She insisted someone review his badge number against department rosters. It took a solid 15 minutes before the officer convinced her to go back inside. But before she left, she threw one final insult over her shoulder. If your house wasn't such a tech eyesore, none of this would have happened. The fire chief turned to me, exhausted. We've had some bizarre calls, but I've never had to prove my own identity while responding to a power grid failure caused by a neighborhood vigilante. I apologized, even though none of it was my fault. He shook his head and said he'd be filing a full report with the city, and that if the backup hadn't been restored before the next shift, someone was going to answer for it. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid of Karen, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And she had no idea just how many systems were connected to the very thing she tried to rip out of our lives. The next morning began with the unmistakable sound of a diesel truck grinding its gears outside my house. I opened the blinds to see a rusted white van parked half on the curb, half in my yard, with the words "Greg's Home Repairs" stenciled on the side in fading black letters. I didn't recognize the name, but I sure as hell recognized the man stepping out. Karen's cousin Greg, a man who once tried to sell me a fake home warranty plan at a neighborhood barbecue. He was scratching his head with one hand and holding a toolbox in the other, his eyes fixed on my charging station like it was the final boss in a video game he didn't understand. My stomach turned as I stepped outside, already knowing this day would go sideways fast. Greg greeted me like we were old friends. "Morning, champ. Karen told me to take care of this eyesore. Said you've been causing grid interference, or something." I asked him if he was licensed to handle high-capacity relay installations. He laughed and said, "Electricity is electricity, man. I wired my uncle's fishing cabin with nothing but a car battery and some jumper cables." I was about to stop him when he reached out and touched the panel. The system hissed. Sparks popped out like angry bees. Greg jerked back and shouted, "What the hell is this, a trap?" I warned him again that the system was not a DIY project. It was tied into a municipal relay grid, permitted and mapped by the county, and tampering with it could trigger a security response. He looked at me blank-faced and said, "Well, Karen says it's coming down, so unless you want to be the reason the HOA sues you, I suggest you step aside." I didn't move. Not because I thought I could stop him, but because I needed to record everything. I already had my phone in my hand. By the time he popped the panel open and started pulling wires like spaghetti noodles, I was already emailing the footage to my city liaison. Within minutes, he had disabled the main inverter, removed the weather shield, and started coiling my industrial cables like he was organizing extension cords for a garage sale. One of the loops snagged a conduit running underground, and suddenly, a fuse exploded. Smoke shot up from the ground, and Greg leaped back, dropping the cable and shouting, "It's live! It's freaking live! No kidding!" I rushed to the garage and manually shut down the secondary breaker, but the damage was already done. When I returned outside, Greg was on the phone with Karen, shouting something about sparks and sabotage. I didn't need to hear her response. 10 minutes later, she pulled up in her Lexus, stepped out in a full tracksuit like she was there for a PR event, and started berating me in front of Greg like I was a criminal. She declared loudly that I had installed illegal electrical equipment and endangered the community. I calmly reminded her that the system was city-approved and permitted. She pulled out a crumpled stack of papers, photocopied pages from some HOA handbook from 2009, and began pointing at random paragraph. "See right here, it says no unapproved electrical structures may be visible from the street." I asked her if she was planning to sue the fire department too, since they approved the installation in conjunction with emergency services. She ignored the question and waved over Greg, who was now using my hose to cool off his hand. He looked like a man who'd tried to microwave a fork. The shouting match attracted a small crowd of neighbors. Most of them kept their distance, watching with curious eyes. A few even filmed quietly. That's when the real hammer dropped. Later that afternoon, I received an official notice from the HOA stating that I was being fined $10,000 for non-compliance with community infrastructure standard. It claimed I had created a safety hazard, disrupted aesthetic continuity, and installed equipment without HOA review, despite the documented approvals on file and the original permit co-signed by the previous HOA president before Karen's regime took over. The notice also warned that failure to remove the equipment would result in escalating penalties and possible eviction through deed violation enforcement. I felt like I'd stepped into some twisted HOA twilight zone. This wasn't just petty control anymore. This was targeted destruction, using the bureaucracy of the HOA like a weapon. I emailed a copy of the notice to my lawyer, to the city energy department, and to the fire chief himself. The fire department responded almost immediately. They were livid. They asked me for system diagnostics and requested drone footage, if available. That gave me an idea. I pulled out my hobby drone and launched it over the neighborhood. I began recording wide sweeps, not just over my property but over Karen's as well. She had made a habit of hiding HOA-related materials in her garage. After all, she treated the HOA like her personal kingdom. Sure enough, through a small gap in the side window, the drone captured a view of several electrical components, coiled copper wire, cut conduit, and even my stolen panel faceplate leaning against a ladder. Greg's van was parked beside it, back doors open, revealing more wiring, several burnt fuses, and what looked suspiciously like salvaged parts from my charging system. Jackpot! I compiled the drone footage into a neatly time-stamped video with audio overlays and sent it to the fire department, the power company, and a contact at the county zoning office. By the time the sun began to set, I had received 2 calls and 3 emails confirming that an investigation was being launched. One email in particular caught my attention. It was from the power company's grid resilience team. They wanted to know how much backup capacity had been lost due to the interference. I told them roughly 30%. That's when they said it outright. If there's an outage or demand spike before restoration, your sector will be exposed. The hospital is just outside that zone. So is the fire station. Your neighbor may have just put hundreds of lives at risk. Those words rang in my ears for the rest of the night. This wasn't just a squabble over some HOA landscaping rule. This was critical infrastructure, under threat from a woman who thought she knew better than certified engineers, electricians, and emergency planners. And she had enlisted an unqualified cousin to carry out her sabotage. The next day, I received another visit. This time from 2 fire department engineers and an official from the city's infrastructure safety division. They inspected the damage, reviewed the footage, and confirmed what I already suspected. Karen and Greg's interference had not only disabled the relay but compromised the integrity of the grid link. One of the engineers held up the melted conduit in disbelief and muttered, "This cable was never meant to be pulled like that." She yanked a $2,000 armored line like it was an extension cord. As the engineers began their emergency repairs, I sat on the curb with Baxter at my side and watched Karen peek through her blinds like a spy in a bad soap opera. She had no idea that the walls were closing in around her, that her actions had triggered reports, audits, and legal reviews that reached far beyond our little neighborhood. And the best part was, I hadn't said a word to her since the incident. The systems she tried to destroy were already speaking for themselves. And soon, so would the law. It happened at 3:17 a.m. The wind howled in sharp, pulsing gusts and rain came down like nails. Trees bent, windows shook, and somewhere in the distance, a transformer blew with a flash of blue lightning. I sat up in bed the moment the house flickered into darkness. Not a second later, my phone buzzed with the alert I never wanted to see. Grid failure in Zone 4. Backup response not detected. That zone included the fire department, a care facility for disabled veterans, and the eastern street where the storm drains regularly failed. This was no ordinary outage. This was the exact nightmare we had tried to prevent when we built the emergency solar relay system. And thanks to Karen and her cousin's sabotage, we were now completely exposed. I scrambled into my clothes, grabbed my manual override toolkit, and was out the door in less than 2 minutes. Baxter barked twice as I bolted through the rain toward the garage. With the main charging system still compromised, the only way to restore partial flow was through the manual inverter, a job designed to be handled by 2 certified engineers and a control room. But I knew the system inside out. I built the damn thing. I wasn't about to let a disaster unfold while I stood still. By the time I reached the backup node embedded under the garage access panel, the water was already pooling in the street. I had to kneel in several inches of cold, grimy runoff to unscrew the flood-sealed hatch. The control unit inside blinked red. Dead battery. Main conduit, severed. It still showed the damage done by Greg when he'd torn the cable loose days earlier. I bypassed the warning and activated a temporary circuit bridge. It buzzed to life, humming like a nervous heart. Seconds later, I saw the green light pulse. Short-term power was rerouted to Fire Station 4's essential response system. But it wasn't enough. The rest of the system needed a full reboot, and for that, the relay located 2 blocks down, inside the public utility shed, had to be accessed. I slammed the hatch shut and took off down the road in the downpour, flashlight bouncing, wind shoving me sideways. I wasn't alone. As I passed the corner near Maple and Birch, I saw 2 firefighters hustling toward a smoldering scene up ahead. A house on the end lot had caught fire. Lightning strike, they said later. But in that moment the hydrant pressure was weak. I heard one of them yell into the radio, "We're only getting a trickle here. We need full PSI." And I knew immediately why. Without the relay functioning at full capacity, the water boosters wouldn't engage. That meant firefighters had to rely on whatever the main line could muster, and in a neighborhood that had aging infrastructure, that wasn't much. Flames were starting to lick out of the attic vents, and neighbors had gathered in pajamas and robes, holding umbrellas and watching in horrified silence. I ran past them, through puddles and flashing lights, until I reached the utility shed. My city access badge still worked. Thank God for that. Inside, I pulled the emergency bypass switch and began the sequence to reboot the booster grid. The backup grid link coughed, blinked, and then surged. I watched as the transfer relay lit green and water pressure surged back to 100%. Seconds later, I heard the scream of high-pressure water explode from the fire hoses. The flames began to die back. The crew got control, and I just sat there for a moment, soaked and shaking, realizing how close we had come to losing lives over something so stupidly avoidable. The next morning, the neighborhood looked like it had aged a decade overnight. Branches scattered the lawns, storm debris was piled up near gutters, and the scorched remains of the end-lot house told the story of what nearly became a tragedy. And just as people were starting to pick up the pieces, Karen emerged from her front door with her yoga mat and a cup of chamomile like it was any other sunny morning. I stood across the street, arms crossed, waiting. She didn't even look at me as she unrolled her mat and began her stretches. It was like the sirens, the power loss, and the firefighters didn't exist in her world. But her delusion didn't last long. Around mid-morning, a city official's black SUV rolled up and parked right in front of her house. Two men in business attire and high-vis jackets stepped out. One carried a clipboard, the other a portable tablet. Karen stepped out to greet them, all smiles and fake warmth, but they cut her off before she could launch into one of her charm offensives. They pointed to her garage. She looked confused, then annoyed. The tone shifted. A crowd slowly began to gather. I joined the gathering just in time to hear one of the officials ask Karen for permission to inspect the garage. She flat out refused. That's when he presented her with an inspection warrant, signed by the municipal judge and backed by emergency authorization following the storm response failure. Karen's face went pale. She stammered something about harassment, about needing to call her lawyer. But they didn't wait. The police officer who had arrived with them unlocked the garage with a master code provided by Greg, who apparently had already flipped to save himself. Inside, the officials found it all: my stolen charging cable, the melted panel face, the scavenged copper from the damaged system, and even old components taken from previous HOA installations. The mess looked like a failed science experiment, and a junkyard had a baby. One of the officials held up a scorched coil and said flatly, "This could have burned down the entire block." Karen tried to argue that it wasn't hers, that Greg stored it there without her knowledge. But surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera told a different story. It showed Karen hauling the components in herself the night after Greg dismantled my unit. Things unraveled quickly after that. By the afternoon, the city held a surprise emergency town hall meeting at the local rec center. Word had spread. Everyone came. Even Eugene, the previously passive HOA president, showed up for the first time in months looking like a man who had finally found his spine. I was asked to present my case first. I brought data, footage, blueprints, and power logs. Then I showed the drone footage of Greg and the contents of Karen's garage. Finally, I presented a copy of the letter from the fire department stating how close we came to catastrophe and who they held responsible. Karen, for her part, tried to spin it. She brought printed screenshots from blogs about electromagnetic radiation. She claimed she was trying to protect children from dangerous rays. The room erupted in disbelief. A woman stood up and shouted, "My kid has a breathing monitor that failed because of you." An older man with a cane yelled, "You nearly burned down the whole damn street and now you're talking about space beams?" It was chaos. But it was also the truth coming out in full force. The final blow came from Eugene himself. He stood slowly, cleared his throat, and read a statement prepared by the remaining board members. Effective immediately, Karen was being removed as vice president of the HOA for misconduct, endangerment, and misuse of community authority. Furthermore, pending city action, she was banned from participating in any future HOA governance decisions and would be subject to legal review under civil and possibly criminal code. Karen didn't speak. She simply grabbed her things and left the rec center as people quietly stepped out of her way. No yelling. No protest. Just the slow, stiff march of someone who had finally realized the world didn't revolve around their tantrums. It was oddly silent. Almost like a curtain had fallen on a one-woman play nobody wanted to see again. That night, as I walked Baxter down the street, neighbors waved at me. People who hadn't spoken more than a few words in months were now openly thanking me. Someone had placed a small homemade sign near my garage that said Neighborhood Hero with a smiley face drawn in marker. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt exhausted. But the lights were on. The station was running. And for the first time in weeks, the grid was steady. Karen might have pulled the plug, but the community had just plugged back in. The following morning began unlike any other. It wasn't birdsong or the faint hum of my solar inverters that woke me, it was the rumble of government-grade tires and the hollow knock of urgency on my door. I opened it to find two suited officials standing beside a woman in a navy jacket emblazoned with a small FEMA badge. Behind them was a sleek black van bearing the Department of Homeland Security's Energy Infrastructure Division insignia. I had seen that logo only once before, during a conference presentation on critical grid vulnerabilities. They didn't introduce themselves with pleasantries. They asked for access to my charging system, power logs, relay backups, and, most concerning of all, a full written timeline of Karen's interference. I led them to the garage in silence, still trying to fully process the weight of their arrival. Inside, they inspected every piece of tech, every inch of cable, and every data log stored on my cloud-linked tablet. They didn't smile. They didn't small talk. They worked with the clinical intensity of people who were trained to assess disaster prevention at the national level. After nearly 30 minutes of scanning and digital cross-checks, one of the agents turned to me and said something I never expected to hear in my own driveway. This wasn't just local sabotage. The relay failure created a cascade condition across multiple emergency sectors. You're sitting on a federally mapped redundancy node. I nodded slowly, understanding but not fully believing what it meant. I had built the system to be resilient, to serve as a clean bridge for the fire department, maybe the local care center, and a few medical priority households in the area. But apparently, during a recent infrastructure upgrade, the utility company had rerouted multiple nodes for efficiency, meaning my system had silently become a cornerstone of the entire quadrant's emergency grid. What Karen saw as an eyesore had become a critical safety buffer for over 800 homes, including 2 emergency routes and a hospital overflow. The agent explained that the grid disturbance triggered an automatic report at the federal level, flagging a sudden loss of backup response capacity during an ongoing weather alert. It had taken them 36 hours to verify that it wasn't a software error. Now that they had confirmed it was physical sabotage, they were treating it as a security breach. I asked them what they were planning to do. The lead agent said plainly, "We need to stabilize the node. Then we need to question the person who disabled it." Within hours, the street was crawling with more utility vehicles, municipal workers, and quiet men in windbreakers carrying toolkits and badges. The city had coordinated with DHS and FEMA to oversee emergency repairs, and they were using my driveway as the staging point. I watched as they laid down new conduit, shielded it, rerouted lines through temporary housings, and reinforced the station with what looked like military-grade insulation. All while Karen watched through her blinds from across the street, her lips pursed like she was sucking on the lemon of her own downfall. Sometime around noon, a black and white cruiser rolled up in front of her house. Out stepped a plainclothes investigator accompanied by an officer. Karen opened the door with that smug posture she always wore when she thought she had the upper hand. But her expression shifted when the man pulled out a digital pad and began reading a statement of violation. Her arms folded. Her head shook. But the officer's body language said it all. This wasn't a request. They entered her home, not as neighbors, not as city inspectors, but as agents carrying a legal mandate to review a federal sabotage report. From where I stood, I couldn't hear every word, but I saw enough. Boxes were brought out. Phones. A laptop. Evidence bags filled with pages, flash drives, and small components. And then came Greg. He arrived 30 minutes later in a rust-colored pickup and was intercepted immediately by 2 DHS agents. They showed him something on a tablet. His face dropped. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again before he finally nodded and stepped quietly into the back of their van. What happened next was surreal. Karen was escorted outside. Not handcuffed, not arrested, but flanked by 2 agents and seated in a separate vehicle. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. No one shouted. No one waved. Everyone just stood on their porches, dogs forgotten, coffee cooling, as the woman who had ruled the HOA like a petty dictator was driven off to answer for crimes she didn't even understand the magnitude of. Back in my garage, I worked with the DHS engineers to rebuild what had been destroyed. They weren't just restoring the system. They were upgrading it. One of them said, if this node had stayed operational, the fire suppression delay last night might have been avoided. That stuck with me. I'd replayed that fire in my mind too many times already. The smoke, the low water pressure, the frantic yells. All because one woman decided she didn't like the look of a cable. The rebuild took 2 days. When it was done, the system had a new exterior housing made of hardened polymer, dual digital access locks, tamper detection sensors, and a 3-point redundancy failover. The control panel inside glowed with updated firmware and a new name on the main access screen, Node 4C Author, L. Hunter. My name, etched into a system that now protected lives beyond anything I had imagined when I first plugged it in. Later that evening, I was invited to a meeting at City Hall, not as a defendant, not as a witness, but as a consultant. Representatives from Public Works, Emergency Services, and Urban Planning all sat around the table. They wanted to know how I built the system, how I handled the relay configurations, how a single civilian had managed to design a more efficient power node than most contracted utility firms. I showed them my plans, my data, my models. They offered me a temporary advisory role on the city's emergency grid modernization project. I accepted without hesitation. Meanwhile, Karen's world continued to collapse in slow motion. According to a contact at the zoning board, her HOA leadership had been completely dissolved pending a city audit. Funds that had been misappropriated under her tenure were now under investigation. Greg, desperate to avoid prosecution, had entered a cooperation agreement and provided full documentation of their tampering, including screenshots of text messages where Karen joked about ripping out the neighborhood's Wi-Fi leashes. Those messages would eventually make their way into a court filing. And then came the cherry on top. The city issued a public acknowledgement of the system's role during the outage and held a press event to announce the completion of the new grid node. Reporters showed up. One even asked me on camera how it felt to have my charging cable almost start a disaster. I answered truthfully. It wasn't the cable that nearly caused the disaster. It was ignorance, and arrogance, and an HOA official who thought she knew more than engineers, fire crews, and federal regulators combined. After the camera turned off, a firefighter I recognized walked up and handed me something wrapped in red tape. I opened it to find my original cable, scorched and frayed but still intact at the core. A note was attached. "You kept us running. Thought you'd want this back." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That night, I mounted the damaged cable in a wooden frame and hung it on the wall in my home office. Not as a trophy but as a reminder of how fragile our systems really are, of how quickly one entitled person can create chaos, but also of how people can come together to fix what's broken. Karen tried to unplug an entire community. What she didn't count on was that the community, once awakened, would plug back in, stronger, smarter, and ready for anything. 2 weeks later, the neighborhood looked the way it always should have. Quiet, balanced, safe. The burned-out home at the end of the block was already being rebuilt with a fresh foundation, and the smell of sawdust and pine replaced the acrid smoke that had haunted the street for days. My charging station stood proudly in its new armored casing, gleaming under the morning sun like a silent guardian. For the first time in months, I no longer felt the pulse of tension behind my ribs every time I walked outside. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful. A long overdue exhale for a community that had lived under the thumb of Karen's tyranny. But peace didn't come with forgetting. It came with reckoning. Karen was no longer in her house. After the federal agents had done their part, a citywide order barred her from all HOA business for the foreseeable future. She wasn't arrested, but the civil suit filed by the city against her and Greg was massive. Multiple charges of infrastructure sabotage, unauthorized access to utility equipment, theft of municipal property, and obstruction of emergency response. Greg, in his desperation to cut a plea deal, had revealed even more than anyone expected. Not only had they dismantled my system, they had done the same with other neighbors' setups. Solar panels, internet boosters, even a medical cooling unit that powered a neighbor's insulin fridge. All without permission. All under the guise of HOA beautification. Karen had treated the HOA like her own little army, and now that army had vanished, leaving her alone with the wreckage she created. The city placed her property under legal review, and liens from various departments began piling onto her title. First came the fire department's claim, citing her interference in the hydrant pressure delay. Then the zoning board slapped her with back penalties for unpermitted electrical modifications. Even the power company got involved, billing her for the emergency crews and the cable replacement work that had to be expedited due to her sabotage. When I walked past her home one morning, I saw the bright orange notice stuck to the window, "Property in default pending municipal action." She had lost everything, and not a single neighbor raised a voice in protest. In fact, when she left in a rented sedan, not one person even looked her way. She wasn't screamed at. She wasn't harassed. She was ignored. And that was worse for someone like Karen, who thrived on being the center of control. But the story didn't end with her exit. It only shifted. The neighborhood, finally free, found itself asking what came next. Without Karen's meddling and constant rule changes, we were suddenly free to reshape our community into something actually functional. The interim HOA board, led by Eugene, who finally showed the backbone we'd all hoped for, began reviewing every fine, complaint, and rule Karen had enforced during her reign. Turns out over 75% of the citations she issued were bogus or outdated, with no legal standing. Refunds were issued. Apologies were made. And perhaps most importantly, the HOA bylaws were completely rewritten under city guidance, incorporating real infrastructure guidelines, resident protections, and an emergency grid compliance clause that was unofficially nicknamed the Karen Rule. Meanwhile, my involvement with the city deepened. After the success of the upgraded emergency relay, I was asked to co-chair the Urban Energy Modernization Initiative, a project that looked at integrating residential renewable systems into the broader grid. What started as a side project in my garage had become a case study presented at a regional energy summit. I found myself in meetings with engineers, city officials, and first responders, discussing everything from outage scenarios to policy loopholes. One morning I woke up to find an article written about me titled "The Man Who Powered the Block While the HOA Pulled the Plug." It was surreal, to say the least. Despite all that, the thing I found most rewarding wasn't the meetings or the attention. It was seeing the shift in how my neighbors talked to each other. For years, Karen had divided everyone. Neighbors lived beside one another but rarely spoke beyond the occasional forced hello. But now, conversations flowed. One neighbor invited the block over for a barbecue. Another offered to help clean the community garden Karen had once shut down for being too messy. We weren't just a row of homes anymore. We were becoming a real community. And in the middle of it all stood the thing Karen had hated most, my charging station. The very same cable she had ripped out now powered the upgraded fire suppression relay, supported 2 emergency medkits, and fed back into the local school's emergency lighting system. And then, as if the universe had saved one final twist for the road, a letter arrived. It was from Karen. A real letter, handwritten in aggressively perfect cursive. I opened it slowly, not sure what to expect. An apology, a threat, a rant? It was all 3 somehow. She blamed the city, the HOA, the fire department, and even the weather. She never admitted fault but danced around the edges of remorse, saying things like, "If I had known the extent," and "my intentions were always for the betterment of the neighborhood." But buried in the final paragraph was something that actually made me laugh out loud. She asked for a character reference. Apparently, part of her settlement agreement involved mandatory community service, and she was hoping I would vouch for her so she could avoid additional hours. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the letter to the city clerk handling the civil case, and then put it in a drawer where it could quietly collect dust with the rest of the wreckage she'd left behind. A week later, the HOA held its first official meeting under the new leadership. It was held in the community center, no longer in Karen's living room, and featured an open mic format. I sat in the back, not intending to speak, just wanting to see how things unfolded. But when the floor opened, an elderly man stood and asked, "What should we do with the money Karen had stashed in the HOA discretionary account?" People murmured. Apparently, she had accumulated a small fortune from improperly collected fines and dues. After a brief debate, someone suggested using the money to install community-wide backup batteries and emergency solar lights. The vote passed unanimously. I found myself smiling, imagining how Karen would react knowing her slush fund would now pay for the very systems she tried so hard to destroy. As the meeting wrapped up, Eugene approached me and said something simple that stuck with me. "Sometimes you don't need to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you just need to keep the lights on long enough for the truth to show." He was right. Karen's tantrums, sabotage, and endless power plays couldn't withstand the clarity of transparency and community. In the end, it wasn't just about one cable. It was about what that cable represented: progress, responsibility, and the quiet power of doing the right thing even when no one's watching. As I walked home that evening with Baxter trotting beside me, the street was calm. Families sat on porches. Kids played tag without fear of being fined. A soft orange glow came from the new solar lights lining the sidewalk, installed just 2 days prior. And my station, once the source of Karen's fury, stood as a quiet reminder of everything we had survived. Above it, mounted on the wall just beside the armored housing, was the scorched cable she had yanked. I framed it with a plaque that read, "Pulled by force, rewired by purpose." Karen tried to rip out more than a cable. She tried to dismantle the very fabric of our community. But in the end, she didn't break us. She sparked us. She lit a fuse that burned away the nonsense and left behind a neighborhood stronger, brighter, and more connected than it had ever been. And the next time someone asks me why I wired my own system into the emergency grid, I'll just smile and say, because I knew one day, someone like Karen would try to unplug it, and I made sure she couldn't.